Headlines frequently warn us about the dangers of an opioid epidemic in the United States. Our next guest joins us to share a different warning related to opioids. Patrick Gleason is Vice President of State Affairs for the group Americans for Tax Reform. Welcome back to the program, Patrick.
Delighted to be with you, Mitch.
So your warning isn't to do with the dangers of the drug itself, but the prospect of taxation linked to opioids. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, it's the latest tax fad, Mitch. So for decades, the go-to tax hike targets have been alcohol and tobacco. But starting about a decade ago, we saw state lawmakers get more creative with their go-to targets, and they moved from so-called sin taxes on tobacco and booze as their targets to other things like soda and snack foods. Well, they have a new target now. There's a new fad tax for 2018, and it's tax on opioids, a special opioid tax. We've seen about a dozen states introduce it. It's been introduced under the auspices of this is going to address the opioid addiction crisis, but our organization has come out against that because we disagree with that contention.
So basically, would this work like what have been traditionally called the sin taxes, where you've seen a special tax on cigarettes or alcohol? There would actually be a tax on all those pills of opioids?
Yeah, so it would. And it would be, in most proposals, it would be applied at the manufacturer level. Though, as with most taxes, these eventually are passed along the cost to consumers. And just to highlight that, in fact, was Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York just made New York the first state to enact a special opioid tax. They did this last month when Governor Cuomo signed the bill into law. And Governor Cuomo was speaking out of both sides of his mouth. He was a champion of this special tax. He was saying this will not be passed along to consumers and result in a regressive tax increase, as we were contending it would. Yet at the same time, his own budget document, the section on that tax said this cost will be passed along. So he admitted it in his budget document, even though he would not admit in public statements that this regressive tax increase is ultimately passed along. And I would contend, though, the opioid addiction crisis is a serious issue that very much needs to be addressed and has ravaged a number of communities across the country. But I would contend, and my organization, Americans for Tax Reform, contends a special tax on opioids is not the solution. In fact, addicts, by definition, are among the least price-sensitive actors in a market. So these will not address the opioid addiction crisis. They do serve as distractions from real solutions, and at the end of the day, they have negative unintended consequences in the form of a regressive tax hike.
Is this seen as the potential for a large money grab, or is it more the sense that, you know, people are mad about these opioids, and this is a way that we could get at least a little bit of extra money out of them?
Well, that's how these opioid tax proposals and this new trend shares a lot of things in common with previous tax fads on things I mentioned like soda and snack food taxes or bag taxes. It's a new tax that's sold under the auspices of doing some form of good, some altruistic cause, cleaning up the environment, making people healthier, when, as is the case with those punitive regressive Pigouvian tax increases, they don't improve health, they don't make the environment cleaner, but all they really do is they serve as an altruistic guise for a money cash grab. And it's no different with these opioid tax proposals. They're shameless cash grabs introduced and advanced under the guise of a addiction mitigation model. And what we are arguing to lawmakers is, one, they don't address or mitigate addiction, and two, this is just a shameless cash grab passed under a disguise. So that's what we see.
That is the voice of Patrick Gleason. He is Vice President of State Affairs for the group Americans for Tax Reform. You mentioned New York is the first state that has actually enacted this. Tell us how it works there.
Yeah, so it's applied at the manufacturer level. This was introduced early in the year. Actually, Cuomo came out, and this was a proposal that he championed. In some states, we've seen this introduced in the legislature, but in New York, Cuomo championed this. And actually, this actually ties into a common theme we're seeing in a host of other tax proposals, and which is, I would call it taxing tragedy. In response to various tragedies, whether they're mass shootings or, in this case, opioid addiction crisis, which is tearing communities apart, the response from too many politicians and interest groups has been a new spending program or a new tax, when those don't get at the root causes of these problems, which often cases are behavioral. Whether it's an opioid tax, it doesn't get at addiction, or it's a bag tax, it doesn't reduce the environment. The problem is behavioral. There are more root causes that need to be gotten at, and this knee-jerk reaction to introduce a tax or a new spending program in response to tragedy is unfortunately too prevalent. We've seen it with gun tax proposals, both nationally in Congress and in states like California, and again, opioid taxes, bag taxes, soda taxes, they do not address the problem they are intended or sold under as addressing. That's the problem.
Now, one of the things that you often hear in debates is sort of the simple argument that if you want more of something, you subsidize it, and if you want less of something, you tax it. I'm guessing that some of the people pushing for the opioid tax are using that sort of simple formulation, but what you're telling us is you need to think beyond that simple argument and look at whether this is actually dealing with the problem, and it isn't.
Yeah, and I would also like to mention one unintended negative consequence of these opioid taxes, and these have dire budgetary implications for states, as states, through Medicaid programs, which is the costs are shared between states and the federal government, states are large purchasers of opioids. So a state like New York, when they institute an opioid tax, the state was actually taxing itself, since they will be paying that tax as one of the largest buyers of pharmaceuticals, including opioids. So among the many reasons, the fact that it doesn't address addiction, the fact that it results in a regressive tax increase, it would also have the state taxing itself. So just one of the many reasons why lawmakers should reject an opioid tax proposal should it be introduced in Raleigh or another state capital.
And you just mentioned Raleigh. We should point out, because most of our listeners are in North Carolina, that this is not something that we've seen yet really gain any kind of traction in North Carolina. But if someone within the General Assembly hears this and says, hey, this is a great idea, I'd like to put forward this proposal for an opioid tax, what would you tell them?
I would want to have a meeting with them so I could spend more time walking them through why it's a bad idea. I would let them know I'd be coming to testify against it. But I would say this is not the solution to the opioid addiction crisis. This will have other negative unintended consequences in addition to not addressing the problem. And again, this is a distraction from the real solution. So the closest state to introduce one to North Carolina has been Tennessee. Lawmakers there wisely rejected it and adjourned session without passing it. I recommend lawmakers in North Carolina do the same should it be introduced here.
You mentioned that this fits in with somewhat of a pattern. We've seen sin taxes for years and years, but you've mentioned, in addition to the traditional alcohol and cigarette taxes, things like soda and bag taxes and things of that sort. Do you suspect, given what you've seen in recent years, we're likely to see more of these types of things in the future? Something looks bad to some legislators, so let's have a new tax focusing on that item.
Yes, I do expect that, and for the reason the reason it's always been the case, the old Huey Long saying, "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the man behind the tree." That is the go-to strategy for politicians who want to increase taxes. So they always want to raise the tax on the others, some maligned populations, some unpopular activities. So certainly, it's the path of least resistance to raising taxes for politicians. So I expect to see the strategy continue.
We mentioned that New York has passed this, and I think you said a dozen states have at least talked about it. Is it likely that any other states at this point are going to move forward, or are you having success so far fighting back against an opioid tax?
Yeah, so I mentioned New York was the first and so far only state to enact one. The Republican-controlled Kentucky House of Representatives was actually the first legislative chamber to enact one about a month ago, though the state Senate there and Governor Matt Bevin rejected it. There are a few threats, bills still pending out there that could pass that our organization is watching. We're keeping an eye on things in St. Paul at the state capital of Minnesota, where an opioid tax proposal is still pending, and also in Vermont at the capital up there in Montpelier. There is a proposal still pending, and we hope that is put to bed and rejected by lawmakers ultimately before they adjourn tomorrow. So we remain vigilant, and that's what's still out there this year, and we expect to see these reintroduced next year as well. So this will be a fight and discussion we'll be having for a while, we expect.